Hello and welcome to Mint Press News. I'm your host, Greg Stoker. I usually do State of Play, which is a stream show bi-weekly or semi-weekly. But now I am here in London in studio, and I'm joined today by Batool Subeiti, energy engineer, political analyst, and commentator. You've been on our platform multiple times. Thank you so much for coming on and discussing Iran.
Always a pleasure and an honor, Greg. It's great to have you in the UK.
So, yeah, great to be here. Super pumped to not be in America right now.
I feel you.
Yeah, so basically what we wanted to do, and the premise of this whole episode is kind of to do a foundational approach to Iran, Iranian politics, nuclear deal, which currently, as of time of the recording of this episode, is going into another round of talks in Rome. It's been stalling out over the past couple weeks, I would say, over red lines and also conflicting demands from the Trump administration. Also, Israel is involved, of course, and so we'll get into that more in the end. But we kind of want to build for people who actually just kind of want to have a foundational knowledge of what's going on and a perspective that isn't influenced necessarily by the agenda-ridden establishment media here, both in the UK, the entirety of Europe, pretty much, and of course North America. So thanks for coming on and doing that. So I guess we're going to start with one interesting remark I wanted to make before we get into it was U.S. foreign policy over the past, well, I would say decades, but specifically with regards to Iran and this new iteration of the political dynamics that we're looking at is the the increasing security relationship between Russia and Iran. And I know we probably don't want to go this far back, but there was something called the Great Game in the 19th century where the Russian Empire and the British Empire were fighting for spheres of influence and control over Central Asia and Persia. And so there was a lot of bad blood generated through that. Historically. And so it's just been kind of interesting because of the war in Ukraine and the sanctions placed on Russia and Iran because of, the United States trying to maintain itself as this unipolar power that's kind of pushed Russia and Iran and also like China closer and closer together.
Right, absolutely. And also because Russia and China don't have this doctrine of hegemony and imposition in the region. And that's, even for Iran, dealing with the United States of America is not a red line. It's willing to deal with the US, it's willing to negotiate, it's even willing to kind of open those direct ties, as long as it proves itself to just have basic mutual respect and cooperation and to not be a hegemon, to not sanction, essentially, to not impose secondary sanctions, which mean that other parties and corporation cannot deal with the Islamic Republic. And that's the kind of tone that it uses. It says, the reason that we can't deal with America is because you sanction us. Like, you guys are on the offensive, not us. All we're saying is we want the interests of our countries to be in our hands, and we're willing to support any entity in the region that decides that they want to be free from your hegemony and your imposition and your dictates.
Right. And if they don't do any pushback, the U.S., like kind of the global bully that it has been for many, many decades, will just keep taking and taking and taking. So at some point, they're trying to balance like what they can actually achieve without, backing down. They've been doing a delicate game, it looks like. And I just wanted to start, I guess, foundationally with the three governments that we've had over in the post-World War II era, essentially. Starting with the democratically elected leader, Mohammad Mossadegh, who was deposed in a coup by the MI6 and the CIA.
And Mossad.
Of course. It's always been a tripartite relationship in that part of the world.
Yeah.
And Latin America.
So much for democracy, right?
Yeah, so much for democracy. We can talk about why that happened. Then he was replaced by the Shah, which is, if you're not familiar with, like, you would call a monarch, a king, essentially. And then a popular revolution happened, and the new form of government happened in 1979, and that's currently what we're dealing with. So I guess starting with the democratic state of Iran under Mohammad Mossadegh.
Absolutely. I think that's the key thing that you've mentioned over here, the democratic state.
Yeah.
This was a state that the people voted for, that the people supported. But I'd also add that whenever I see that coups or color revolutions are successful, that to me is a kind of indication of, what is the extent of the real attachment between the people and the leadership itself. So when I see that coups are successful, that to me indicates that, yes, there might have been a will within the people to support Mossadegh, but truly how strong was that? Because if you compare that with 1979, we saw that Iran went through 8 years of literal brutal war that was waged by Saddam on the behest of the West.
Yeah.
Ultimately, this was their war on Iran to try and break down Iran and to try and prevent this revolution from materializing into an actual government. And then we've seen 4 decades of complete economic terrorism. We've seen the worst kind of assassination campaigns on nuclear scientists and the smear campaigns and the kind of targeted isolation of Iran from the whole world and just making the lives of ordinary Iranians absolute hell and misery. But despite that, we see that the Islamic revolution still stands today. So to me, it's kind of a miracle. It's kind of a miracle that when you see a nation go through so much hardship, it still hasn't collapsed. It's still standing, if you will. That is a kind of indication that the real support comes from the people themselves. Because when you're being besieged by the whole world, and America here is telling the Iranian people, just if you get rid of the system of the Islamic Republic,
we'll lift the sanctions, we'll come in and help.
Well, that's the same situation that we're seeing in Syria, right? It's
Absolutely.
like you get rid of Bashar al-Assad, we let the Al-Qaeda lot in. You normalize with the Israeli occupation entity, you won't have to pay the price anymore. The whole price of those sanctions.
You'll get a nice carrot too.
Right, exactly. And that's the state that all the Arab pliant countries are living in, whether it's Jordan, whether it's the UAE. Ultimately, they're not paying that price because they're not in a state of active resistance against American imperialism. So that's an important point to mention when we come to the question of democracy. You see that reflected in the fact that the Islamic Republic of Iran is standing today. The support rests on the people. So in 1953, the deposition of Mohammad Mossadegh was successful, primarily due to, I think, a lot of the propaganda also that the West managed.
Right. So if you actually look at the CIA, MI6, and Mossad tripartite coup, which we could call it, it came as a result of certain things that Mossadegh was doing. One of them was nationalizing the petroleum industry within Iran, which was controlled by the British. Of course, the British were the first to kind of launch this idea of doing a coup. And of course, the Americans and the current president, I think it was Eisenhower at the time.
Yeah,
it was 50. Yeah, they were very leery of it because they had never done something like this kind of operation before, a regime change operation, which after this happened, they kind of created a whole regime change doctrine that they reenacted throughout Africa and Latin America. But this was like the first one that they did. So they're kind of figuring it out as they go. The CIA came with a plan where they bought and infiltrated local newspapers, started doing smear campaigns. They also had a lot of other assets in place, and they had a candidate ready to reinstall once the government was overthrown.
So this just shows you the importance that the role of propaganda and the media machine plays tangibly on the ground in terms of affecting change and leading to actual results. And we saw that in the case of Mossadegh. But I think what's interesting is this guy was a socialist. Like, he didn't come from the Islamic sphere. So when you hear that, for example, the contention might be with the fact that, it's an Islamic republic and that by default means it's a dictatorship. It's absolute nonsense. It's not ideology that the West subscribes to over here. Otherwise, Saudi was that Islamic pole of attraction that they bolstered, and they used to even fight the quote-unquote atheist communist elements at the time.
Yeah.
Right? So the main contention for them is what? Anyone who steps on our interests to be able to milk a country, to milk its resources, to basically jeopardize the American setup for the region. And a cornerstone for the Western project in the region of West Asia has been the Israeli occupation entity. Anyone that becomes an obstacle to that or represents a threat to that, we are not going to accept them, and we are going to strive against them. And that was certainly the case with Mossadegh. And as you mentioned, they put Reza Shah in his place, that was a literal puppet and a dictator that inevitably resulted in the people coming out to the streets, suffering in the tens of the thousands were killed in the mass protests that led up to the deposition of the Shah. And Imam Khomeini led the revolution whilst he was in exile.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so this shows you the extent of the mass mobilization within the hearts and minds of the Iranians at the time, to the point where you had 98.9% of the population who literally said, no East, no West, we want an Islamic Republic. So it's not the Islamic Republic that was an issue, it was the no West.
Yeah.
It was the fact that we're independent, but also we have a model. We now represent a model of independence for the whole region. So now other countries that are shackled within the region, they can also rise up and they can also garner inspiration from this movement. And we can explain a little bit about the reverberations of that within the movement.
Right. I do want to back up and focus a little bit on Israel, especially Israel within the context of Mohammad Reza Shah. So, first of all, especially in the early days of the Cold War, Israel was kind of like the anti-communist sheriff in West Asia. And then Reza Shah became part of that. So Israel's always had what is called like the doctrine of the periphery. It was kind of workshopped in the rule of Ben Gurion, and it basically stipulates that Israel is a small country with no strategic depth. So what it needs to do is cultivate non-Jewish, non-Arab allies within its sphere of influence in order to act as buffers. To fight what they call Arab imperialism, which is ideologically absurd, but that's what they frame it as. So the Maronite Christians in Lebanon were part of that plan. Currently, the Druze
party in Lebanon,
the Druze in Syria are being used as the doctrine of the periphery, along the Golan Heights, both occupied and not occupied. And Imperial Iran under the Shah was a big ally of Israel at the time.
Absolutely.
So I guess that's kind of interesting now, because now they are antithetical like enemies. And I just kind of wanted to ask you, what was the reason that the Shah was so universally reviled that the overwhelming amount of the population wanted a change in government, wanted something different?
Two things. The Shah was absolutely a self-serving monarch. He was someone that, I mean, if you look at the situation of Iran at the time, 1/12 of the population could actually read and write. The level of literacy rates within Iran were extremely low. He was a man who literally institutionalized things like pornography within the cinemas in order to subdue the population, to make them asleep, to put them in that numbed state.
I also heard like anecdotal stuff about having like massive like bourgeois dictator desert parties, and
absolutely
just with public funds.
Well, the vast majority of the nation were completely impoverished, and the people of Iran really felt the brunt of that. That's number one. But number two, and I think the most crucial point over here, was that the people of Iran were willing to pay the price to get out of that state of ultimate submission to the West. You had a population who were energetic, who were alive, who were awake, who were willing to do what it takes and willing to bear the consequences as a result of that revolution, which they have also for the past 4 decades. This is why I say the Iranian nation are very active and alive. So if they really, the vast majority of them, as the West likes to tell us, really do not support the cornerstone of the Islamic Republic and what it stands for in terms of its values, and what are they getting in return for that? They're getting the removal of sanctions in return for that, right? You would have seen an overthrow. It wouldn't have existed. It wouldn't exist today. So this is a key crucial point, is the propensity of the people themselves. That's why you might not see that same movement in other Arab countries, for example, despite the fact that, a lot of these Arab, especially the Gulf countries and monarchs, they have relatively stable economies, right? And the price for that is the lack of support of the Palestinians on the ground, or the normalization with the Israeli occupation entity and the increased ties with the West. That's something that the people of these nations are bearing the brunt of, essentially. So you have those two factors over here.
And so the Shah eventually gets deposed. He flees into exile. And the Islamic Republic is born. And this is where it's really interesting, like studying this, because this is where all the propaganda talking points that we see now were kind of born out of that. So Saddam invades in 1980 with under the assumption, it's coming from the West, that Iran is this weak post-revolutionary state, but it's also a massive threat at the same time. We're seeing that same narrative now, where it's the tentacle of the octopus of terror. It spreads its, like extremism throughout the entire region, and at the same time, it's our greatest adversary, which is bizarre. Kamala Harris said that during her failed presidential bid last year, and that was an absolutely absurd thing to say.
To Western regional interests.
Yeah, she didn't make that. She didn't make that qualifier. Caveat. She just said
Israel has the right to say that, but I don't think America has the right to say that. So that's the difference.
At one point, they're our greatest adversary, but they're also still this very weak post-revolutionary state on the verge of civil upheaval and collapse.
Right.
And that's been around since 1979. So this gets us into Saddam invading. And you said Western interests were behind that. Could you expand on that a little bit?
Well, of course, because I think Imam Khomeini, right from the onset, he made it clear what the vision of the Islamic Revolution is, and that its principles will even overshadow its national interests. What do I mean by that? A country's national interests are very important for it. It has to be ambitious, it has to have a plan. But at the same time, Iran showed that it was willing to actually step on some of those interests for moral positions, So when it comes to supporting the Palestinian struggle, that was very clearly laid out on the table. That was almost like within the constitution. So what were some of the first things that Iran did? They erected the PLO embassy in place of the Israeli embassy. And very famously, Yasser Arafat went to Iran in 1979. He met with Imam Khomeini, and the piercing words that Imam Khomeini told him was, do not rely on America. It's almost like he was foreseeing what was going to happen. Do not rely on America and the Soviet Union. Have faith in God. Draw out your swords and know that the countries within the region that are real, that are based on what is real, they will come to your aid. And here he was talking about the Islamic Republic of Iran. You also had a portion of the religious tax money that was sent to groups like the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, because they were the main active resistant group on the ground back then.
And it's interesting, though, because we have this extreme, very... coming from the neocon side, they're all radical extremists. They only support that, but the PFLP was a socialist resistance movement.
Yeah, exactly. And I remember even the Deputy Secretary Abu Ahmed Fuad from the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, he once said, Qasim Soleimani never once differentiated between the different sects or ideologies of any of the resistance groups on the ground. Were you willing to fight the occupation, or were you willing to surrender? That was the only two lines that he recognized, to the extent that even someone like Yasser Arafat, who Iran had deep disagreements with later on the basis of the Oslo Accords, Iran shipped about 45 tons worth of weapons within the Korean A affair that was later intercepted in around 2005 by Colin Powell and his administration at the time. But that shows you the extent of the flexibility that exists in anyone who wants to fight this common enemy. So even during the 80s, you've brought the example of the Iran-Iraq war, right? When Iran's capabilities were technically decimated. And that was the point. It was to go in, it was to kind of finish off what was the remaining capability so that it can never have the ability to regenerate itself and to be self-sufficient and to stand on its 2 feet. At that time, the IRGC that was newly formed sent its men to Lebanon to help them fight the Israeli occupation that occurred in 1982 and onwards. So it's a fact today that liberation of Lebanon, especially the south, in 2000 wouldn't have happened without the Iranian material support. So right from the onset, America knew that these weren't just, hollow words. This wasn't just Imam Khomeini institutionalizing the Al-Quds Day on the last Friday of the month of Ramadan to basically create a sense of a global awakening, and especially to mobilize the people within the Muslim Ummah. I think we need to emphasize that at that time, the Palestinian cause was asleep. The prospect for liberation wasn't there.
This was prior to the first Intifada.
Yes, this was exactly. The first intifada came a decade later. The Ghazan resistance was formed a decade later as well. So we're talking about a time when the Arab state was very passive, was very submissive, was very subdued. The idea of being able to even Imam Khomeini came up and called America a great Satan, right? Like with that courage and that conviction to even dare to speak out against the hegemon of the day, America wasn't going to have that. Especially given that it wasn't just the case of Iran going from, being under American submission and having all of its resources under the American control. I mean, they can go in and take whatever oil they want and it's unaccountable. But it's also the fact that that could potentially spread and reverberate across the whole region. And you see that the resistance movements that have formed in the region, including the Ansar Allah in Yemen, the Palestinian resistance factions, they received all of their material support from this central government that had a vision, that was a nation that was very practical. It had practicability about it. It wasn't just, words. It was action on the ground. Today, Iran is leading in many different fields, scientific fields, militarily speaking, in the manufacturing of drones that, Russia's relied on extensively in its war in Ukraine. To get to that situation, that was the biggest fear of America, to have a country that is saying, this region belongs to us. It should be dictated. The interests of the region should be dictated by the people of the region. And it's not on America to play a chess game.
Further complicated by America's entanglement with Israel, who has the same claim.
Right. So that's quite an important point. Israel is the cornerstone for the Western strategy in the region. And that has also been a big part of the threat that America feels, is that Iran's strategy towards Israel is that it has no right to exist.
Right.
Iran has said that right from the start, that we need to reverse the biggest shame of 1948, and that the only solution is that the Palestinians are given the right to return back and they hold a popular referendum. But honestly, the occupation and the apartheid has to end. That was Iran's stance right from 1979. So in terms of the divergence, Israel versus America, Israel feels existentially threatened by Iran.
Well, it's currently one of the only, I would say, the only government that's completely not comprador to American interests within West and Central Asia. And it's the only one that can currently check Israel's impunity militarily without direct U.S. intervention. Mostly because of their rocket arsenal, and also because Israel just as a military logistics function can't really target Iran in any substantive way without U.S. support. So
100%, that's exactly the case. Israel wouldn't dream of attacking Iran without the American support. And this is where the divergence lies, is that, as far as America is concerned, it has its own regional interests and it cannot bear the brunt of the cost of war. And I think Yemen has shown that very clearly to America. It was almost like that litmus test or testing the waters to see the extent to which it will bow down. And if it's not able to militarily defeat Yemen, there's no way that it could, hell has no case with Iran. And so that has kind of proven the point to America that the cost of war, especially for someone like Trump, who is a man of deals, who is a man of bargains, who would rather achieve the American vision of sustaining economic leverage, building up economic alliances and relations at the expense of America as a quote unquote police state. I think that this is important to state, his view on NATO, his view on the war with Russia. Even if you take his approach of cutting US aid, for example, he's not so much a proponent of, the kind of covert ways of achieving or imposing the American system on the world. From his perspective, he would rather form relations with entities on the ground where he can benefit economically. And I think I would even go as far as saying that would potentially even stretch to the Islamic Republic of Iran. If he could get a good deal from these Iranian drones, he's not going to say no. In all of this, where does Israel stand becomes the question, especially after 19 months of military confrontation in which Israel has proven to be a failure in achieving strategic goals on the ground.
Yeah, I mean, in the words of Ho Chi Minh, leader of the Viet Cong, he's a paper tiger of a military. That all they can do is saturation bomb civilian areas, essentially, and without U.S. support, logistical support going every day out of the air base in Cyprus, they'd run out of munitions. And then what?
But see, Trump doesn't have the patience for that kind of failure.
Right.
So it's not, so right now, the way that I see the American administration approaching Israel is a feeling of, we don't have a problem per se with the genocide and the killing, but we have a problem with the fact that you've not managed to achieve the military strategic objectives on the ground. You've not defeated the resistance movement.
In the end, he will always be a reality TV star. You know, when he was the head of The Apprentice, you're fired. Like, that's basically one of his driving ideologies. And also, I don't want to get too bogged down into contemporary politics right now, but I just want to float this. He's an erratic political actor, but there are some through lines that he's always been consistent about. And that is his loathing of Obama and his legacy. Trump was one of the original birther conspiracy theorists that said, like, he was actually like born in Kenya or something, or Central Africa, and he wasn't actually an American citizen, so he couldn't be president. He is irked that Obama got a Nobel Peace Prize. He wants one. He said it. Elise Stefanik has said it. Scott Bessent. All of his inner circle has gone on national TV and said he deserves a Nobel Peace Prize. He wants a Nobel Peace Prize. And he did back in 2016 during his first presidential election bid. I do have some hope. I'm less pessimistic than a lot of my colleagues about potentially, at the very least, not going to war with Iran, because he can't. There's two ways he can get a Nobel Prize, and that's Russia-Ukraine ceasefire, which is beyond the scope of this conversation, but it's not going to happen, especially not the way he wants it to. And maybe Iran's a possibility. So we're going to talk later in this segment about the JCPOA, the first Iranian nuclear deal that he slashed. Anyways, so I do have some hope right now. But I think now that we've kind of talked about the Iran-Iraq war, at least reference that it happened, Iran was still standing after it. And the major contention and the huge neoconservative talking point about direct intervention against Iran is both in American and Israeli foreign policy circles, which is like the same circle, let's be honest, is their nuclear program. So when did it start? If you could just lay out the bullet points.
Yeah, it's interesting when you say that, because, I mean, look, Iran began enriching in the 60s under the Shah, right? And this was...
No one likes to mention that.
No one likes to mention that. That was under Western auspices. When you look at the region, you find there's a nuclear Pakistan. That's an Islamic country, right? The West doesn't seem that concerned.
Yeah, because India keeps it in check.
Right, exactly. So basically, they can turn a blind eye as and when they please, you know. As we know, obviously, the Israeli occupation entity has nuclear warheads, but it doesn't announce those. So when it comes to the nuclear, that's quite a convenient file that the West can use to target Iran, because also you have international laws like the Non-Proliferation Treaty, for example. So that could basically be used as the gateway to begin negotiations with Iran to get it to curb its power and its potential. The issue is not with Iran having nuclear weapons. The issue is with Iran in the political direction that it is seeking independence from the West and has been towing that line for 4 decades, that is anti-American imperialism. That having a nuclear weapon is a problem. You know, that having a nuclear program is a problem, despite the fact that Iran has made it very clear that it doesn't seek nuclear weapons.
And that was in 1999 or 2002. I forget the exact date when Khamenei put out the statement.
The fatwa.
The fatwa.
Yeah, that was around about that time. Exactly. But from the West's perspective, it just wants to ensure that Iran never gets to a point where it has the power to potentially produce nuclear weapons for the sake of deterrence, because it knows that Iran wouldn't use it, but just as a deterrence capability that can have a destabilizing effect on the region as they see it, especially with, you know, the Gulf entities and Turkey, for example. You know, that would give a certain power to Iran if it was able to get to a point where it can enrich to 60%. You're talking about the ability to make a bomb. So from their perspective, the bomb isn't the issue. Iran under the Shah having a bomb is not a problem. It's just the Iran as it currently is having the power. Otherwise, I mean, they have a problem with their ballistic missiles, right? Like it's their ballistic missiles that have the ability to level Israel to the ground. But they're not able to kind of invoke that because there's no international law that says any country is not allowed to possess ballistic missiles. It's just a part of your national defense strategy.
Right. And kind of the absurdity of that is brought home by, if you study like proliferation during the Cold War, one of Russia's red lines for launching nukes was actually a concerted B-2 bomber campaign from the West, because we could achieve the same amount of target devastation as multiple nuclear bombs just through conventional weapons.
Exactly. And
so
Israel's been doing that anyways in Gaza.
Yeah. They've dropped the net explosive weight of at least 3 nuclear bombs, 3 atomic bombs by now. And so Iran can achieve the same amount of target devastation if they were to put their arsenal to it. But again, that's not something you can leverage. But I guess the hypocrisy about that is even if they're not trying to make a nuclear bomb, they're still allowed to have a civil nuclear program for energy purposes.
And that's within international law.
Yeah.
And it reserves that right. And Iran has made it very clear that that is its red line.
Mm-hmm.
And America, by Witkoff, coming out and saying that, we are calling for zero enrichment, and that is where we stand. I see that as mainly a bargaining chip.
Mm-hmm.
In negotiations, it's
right.
a very common strategy that you'd
play hardball and then walk it back.
Exactly. For them, their real red line is, I don't know, 20% enrichment, and Iran's red line would be zero enrichment. And so you come to a certain compromise, that's somewhere in between. Iran might settle for, I don't know, the 3.5% or the 3.95% that was under the JCPOA. But the threats pre-negotiation and the threats during negotiation haven't managed to make Iran yield. And America knows that. So they're basically playing hard to get right now. That's as far as I'll put it. So in terms of the likelihood of reaching a deal, I think that is a possibility, but it will just take a very long time because of those intricate complexities with the technical aspects of the deal. So for example, where will the Iranian enrichment happen? Iran might, for example, compromise on the location as long as it can ascertain that it is under its full control. So if, I don't know, Iranian enrichment happens in Oman or like an Iranian-friendly country, but under Iranian control, not by the dictates of America or in a way
they've
where
already
America
agreed to regular inspections too.
So. Exactly. The IAEA is a regular inspector and there's been no problems with that. And it's not like Iran has reneged on its side and its responsibilities. So Iran is very clear on where it stands, but America ultimately wants the negotiations are a gateway for them to form a kind of relationship with Iran that they want, that could enable them to impose their red lines and that can enable them to curb Iran's power. So in actual fact, the negotiations in and of themselves are a kind of acknowledgement of Iran's regional influence.
Right, because if we didn't have to negotiate with them, we wouldn't. It's that simple.
Exactly. You have to, and much to the dismay of Netanyahu, and much to the dismay of the Israeli occupation entity that completely don't want negotiations. They just want a strike because they feel existentially threatened, and I think that's the key.
Exactly. And at the time of this recording, this will probably be about a week's old news. This is Friday, May 23rd. But 2 days ago on Wednesday, CNN, which is a mechanism for controlled intelligence leaks from the U.S. intelligence community, cited 2 sources that said Israel was planning a direct attack against Iranian nuclear facilities without U.S. backing. Now, that's absurd. They can't do that. They have very few fighter bombers that could even make it back from a sortie against Iran. They need to refuel over Iraqi airspace in order just to make it back to Israel. They don't have any Stratofortress tankers. They'd have to use ours for mid-air refueling. So that's... Anyways, I don't know how they would do it. Maybe they'd launch out of a secret base in Azerbaijan or something. But anyways, despite the wild speculation, this looked like a controlled leak from the U.S. intelligence community to put it out in the public in order to forestall something that they didn't want to happen. So yes, they're existentially threatened, and they're kind of an irrational actor right now because they've tried um, from the beginning of the extreme violence on a starting on October 8th from their side, been trying to draw us in somehow in the war against Hezbollah, in the war against Hamas, and now potentially a strike against Iran.
Right, right. But ultimately, in all cases, Israel has proven to be a failure. It's not managed to defeat the Gazan resistance. It's not managed to defeat the resistance in Lebanon. Yemen stands strong. In the case of the Islamic Republic of Iran, like you said, it doesn't stand a chance. So politics runs on power and ability. I think that's the key thing.
Mm-hmm.
Israel was created almost as a disciplinary stick for the West in the region to strike any entity that falls outside of line.
Yeah. So what I like to call kind of in American parlance, like in the Wild West, the sheriffs were deputized. There was like this law enforcement officer in like no man's land that had complete like authority to act with impunity throughout the region to raise posses to basically not be held accountable at all. And so they're like our sheriff in the region. They do our dirty work and they're fine doing it. And they also serve our interests too.
Right. But yeah, exactly. But Israel has gone from protecting Western interests to needing net Western protection.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's the key. Pre and post October the 7th has been that turning point. I mean, pre October the 7th, Trump would have looked at the situation and thought, Israel is doing well on the ground. It's achieving strategic goals. Let's recognize the Golan. Let's, shift the embassy to Jerusalem. Let's sign the Abraham Accords, the rest of it. But post October the 7th, when Israel has shown the extent of its failure, I mean, look, Trump was the same man that in his election campaign trail said, Israel is so thin, it needs fattening up, right?
Yeah. Sometimes he says the truth out loud doesn't mean to.
Right.
It's a country with zero strategic depth.
That's it. But then what happens when Israel tries to invade Lebanon and it completely fails? I mean, in the case of Syria, Syria was probably the only strategic blow for the resistance. But again, there was no active resistance when it went into Syria, right?
Right.
So I think that's the key thing. Where there is resistance, Israel has failed. Politics runs on power and ability. The weak has no place in the world of politics. So naturally, inevitably, the West and America's support for Israel will shrink to match Israel's true size. We might not be seeing that right now because you're in the height of the war, but post-war, when Israel disintegrates,
we are seeing it though.
We are seeing it.
They don't even have a liaison in the. They don't even have an observer liaison in the nuclear talks based off of what we see through open source. And they were cut out of the Houthi ceasefire negotiations.
Right, exactly.
There's a separate treaty right now, which I didn't see coming.
Much for those who claim that Israel controls America. I mean, if Israel controls America, why hasn't the American strike on Iran happened, or the Israeli strike with American support? Why did that agreement with the Yemenis happen not just without Israel's knowledge, but Trump was speaking in a way where it was like, you can continue to hit the occupation entity. We only care about our ships in the Red Sea.
Yeah. Stop affecting our bottom line.
Exactly. Why did he have such an issue with Waltz speaking directly with the occupation entity at the expense of his strategy and vision? Why is he completely sidelining Israel on his trip to the region, which has never happened before?
Yeah, and then
Vance
Trump
and Hegseth canceling their
you're right.
Plans.
Sorry, I was just going to say...
Speaking to the Gazan resistance as well. Oh my gosh, all these ideas are coming into my mind. Like, all these tangible realities that we're seeing.
Yeah, and then Witkoff was also like, they're not bad guys. They're reasonable people. And also, Trump was just in Riyadh making a whole bunch of AI business deals in Saudi Arabia. Didn't even stop over in Israel. That's also pretty unprecedented.
That shows us that actually Trump and I'd say the American establishment as well have a propensity to recognize the real and active forces on the ground. And turning a blind eye to the true power balance and where that lies becomes to the very detriment of Western interests. Israel was created at a time when the region was completely weak and completely pliant, and there was no real active resistance.
After the collapse of the Ottoman Empire.
Exactly. What happens when Israel's existence is actually propelling these resistance movements, is strengthening these resistance movements? If Israel didn't invade Lebanon, you wouldn't have had the Islamic resistance of Lebanon.
Right. And they try to frame it like Iran created that, which is patently absurd. I mean, yes, they have their own, like any other nation state, their own power politics engaged in it, but they didn't create the Houthis or Hezbollah or, the popular mobilization units in Iraq.
Right. And the Western strategy supports the two-state solution. We have to understand that that is the default Western strategy, is Israel within certain boundaries, whereas the Zionist movement doesn't subscribe to that. The Zionist movement is inherently expansionist from the Nile to the Euphrates. So from a Western perspective, if Israel can expand without opposition from the region, fine. Do your thing. Like, we will stamp your achievements as long as you're able to do them. But the cutoff line becomes when you're not able to do that, when you face defeat and actually resistance is garnered as a response to that. So we've seen that wherever there is active resistance, Trump would retreat. He puts the kind of maximum scenarios on the table to get the maximum concessions. But ultimately, when faced with resistance, he will back away. And when he sees that there's a genuine economic drain somewhere, he will also withdraw. Mm-hmm. So his whole strategy for, wanting to stop the war between Russia and Ukraine is, instead of sending $350 billion to Ukraine, we might as well just form a deal with Russia. It's just a powerful entity on the ground, and you cannot overlook its power, and would rather get something out of this relationship than keep draining the finance into it. And Israel has become that kind of drain, especially when, as you've mentioned, the propensity of Trump right now to strike $3-4 trillion. We're talking about astronomical numbers over here. That's where his headspace is. Now, this continuing war in Gaza is just creating complications for this region that he wants to stabilize. But the only reason I think Trump called for that war to then resume in March was because Israel was really heading in the direction of disintegration. Mm-hmm. And the resistance was recognized as still too strong in the negotiating tables. So the West being weak, the war ending in Gaza with the West being so weak in the negotiating tables, the Gazan resistance having completely blown Israel out of the water with the worst PR campaign ever in terms of the release of the hostages and the rest of it. That to America, that to Trump was like, okay, we'll give you Israel another 3 months. Show us what you're capable of. Do your thing. We're also talking about the depopulation plans for the people of Gaza. Let's see whether this continued aggression would lead to any kind of results in terms of the people of Gaza saying, we don't support the resistance. We want to, we'll fall into the depopulation plans. But it needs to be seen within that final straw, the final straw that's cutting the camel's back. It's like, we've given you 3 months, Israel, you are incapable. So I think it's only going to go downwards from here. And I think if Israel does end up striking Iran without the American support,
I think it's not going to go well for them.
I think that's Trump trying to shrink Israel to match its true size.
Yeah. So, I mean, they might just try it. But we also have to remember, too, that Iran's nuclear hard sites were not meant to resist or withstand an Israeli attack. They're meant to withstand an American attack. We have far more capabilities than the Israelis. Just to demonstrate this, I say, I don't know why I keep saying, I say we like I support this government. So the United States, and the United States military industrial complex created these things called massive ordnance penetrators, these 30,000-pound bombs. They were developed initially to collapse cave systems in Tora Bora in Afghanistan, with the Taliban and Al-Qaeda were hiding in at that time. And that's kind of what a lot of these hard sites were meant to resist. If you want to collapse, because if you want to collapse the tunnels beneath Gaza, the 2,000-pound bunker buster bombs aren't going to get it done. You would need these massive MOPs, which people colloquially call Moab's mother of all bombs. That's not a real thing. But anyways, not going to get bogged down in military jargon. But that's what it is. They couldn't achieve anything anyways. And of course, Trump, he, as you said, likes to leverage U.S. hard power with sanctions and potential military actions. That's why we massed a B-2 stealth bomber fleet out of Diego Garcia, which is this small strip of land out in the middle of the Indian Ocean that was originally British, but now we own the lease on it, and that's within striking distance of Iran. And we think, we're not sure, that they couldn't retaliate back against that base with their hypersonic missiles. Probably they could. So anyways, it was just a leveraging tactic. And of course, nothing's come of it.
But I think also if Trump does decide, suppose he wakes up and he decides he wants to strike Iran, I think that would be within the context of really determining the true power balance on the ground. Does that make sense? In the same way that Netanyahu, he had the balls to go into Lebanon, despite the fact that those around him, including Gallant, was like to him, no, like you won't be able to defeat the Islamic resistance of Lebanon. Don't. It's going to incur too much of a price. But he did it anyways, you know. And America kind of gave him the green light, and America gave him the space to go into Lebanon and to strike his.
Yeah, that was the Biden administration.
Right. That's okay. Okay, that was the Biden administration, but within that same line of thinking, if it does, and I don't think that this is a plausible possibility in the sense that it's a very low possibility that that would be the case, because really it would be America shooting itself in the foot, and the Israeli occupation entity would bear the brunt first and foremost. So as I mentioned, unless America's thinking we want to get rid of Israel, it would go in that direction. Like let Israel fend for itself. Like let Israel prove the extent that it is able.
Yeah. Go.
Right?
Be free. Good luck.
Exactly.
I don't think that will happen, but you did mention that earlier in the conversation that some of these moves were made because perhaps, and I don't want to be like putting words in your mouth, but Israel is so ideologically driven, it's incapable of saving itself. So we have to, in order to like forestall certain decisions that the government might make that would lead to its collapse. Is that what you're kind of getting at, or did I mishear that?
Basically, just saying that the material reality shows that Israel is too weak on the ground to save itself. Like it doesn't. I mean, look at its military. It barely has reservists that are willing to go fight on the ground.
They put in a muster call for 70,000,
Right.
and they had a gag order on how many people actually showed up in the past couple weeks.
They're not built for that life. They didn't come for that.
No, they came to do 2 years of military service and then work in the tech sector in Tel Aviv and go to parties and travel to Thailand and piss off all the Thai locals and, you know, live a pretty posh, easy life.
Right. They came for a land of milk and honey. That's ultimately it, right?
Yes. Because they turned the swamp into land of milk and honey. Yeah.
Right. And October the 7th was the biggest security penetration in which there's no going back. And the entity will never feel security in its life ever again.
Well, yeah, because most of like what Israel has banked off of for its own national security was what they would call their deterrence capacity. You know, something that was never proved, but, you know, through multi-generations of propaganda, you know, the Mossad is the scariest intelligence organization at all. They hunted down and killed all the Nazis in South America. No. You know, they know what you had for breakfast. They're able to compromise any politician.
But you see, the problem with buying that is that people, even when October the 7th happened, a lot of people said, oh, it's an inside operation because they're too invincible and they're too strong to not be able to hatch that out.
Yeah, so either way, you're losing the information war.
Right.
So,
right.
And then, of course, you know, in military circles, I grew up around a bunch of like Christian Zionists in Texas. You know, I never really bought the sauce, but, you know, I was affected coming from a family that had like service members on both sides of the family by like the post 9/11 propaganda push. So I was like obviously more sympathetic to Israel, but what kind of started to deconstruct like all of this like deterrence capacity propaganda about like Israel being like our greatest ally. They're super scary. They're the lion of the Middle East in terms of the military. Was when I got into the service, I started reading like Pentagon position papers and stuff from the U.S. Army War College out of Fort Leavenworth in Kentucky, based off like war games and war analysis perspectives and stuff. And read so many position papers from the 2006 Hezbollah-Lebanon war that everybody was forced in the U.S. military to read because a mechanized infantry force, which Israel was and is, was defeated by a dismounted asymmetrical conventional force. And it's the position of the U.S. military that the 2006 Israel-Hezbollah war was a strategic defeat for Israel. And that's when like every like NATO military was like, oh my God, what just happened? So through actual like military reporting, that's kind of where I started to like get de-indoctrinated, interestingly enough. But despite that, they've had this massive media apparatus that has its tentacles throughout like the Western world and all the mainstream media sources that kind of erased everything that happened in the 2006 wars and portrayed a image of victory for Israel and defeat for Hezbollah. with, to the with the extension of Lebanon itself as a nation state.
Yeah.
Uh, so, but now everybody sees that because the same mistakes they made then they made now. It's almost like saturation bombing, turning everything to rubble so you can't drive your armored personnel carriers over it is not the best course of action. And now that people see that, I don't know how they get it back. This image,
Right. And they can't get it back. But ultimately, I mean, all this propaganda is literally for one thing and only. We cannot look at Israel as a separate project or a
right?
separate entity. It cannot breathe without the American oxygen. And that alone is enough to tell you who controls who.
Hmm.
But it's like Israel needs to be useful on the ground.
Hmm.
When Israel is no longer useful to us, that is when the American frustration will begin. That is when the European countries will feel emboldened to kind of follow the footsteps and the waves that they see the American direction going in. So when I see, for example, Europe coming out today, making these statements against the occupation entity, talking about, supposed sanctioning of.
I mean, they wrote a strongly worded letter saying that human rights were about to be violated.
Mm,
um,
change doesn't happen overnight.
I know it really doesn't, and
But that in itself is huge. We went from Israel has a right to completely defend itself. They're fighting savages and human animals, which someone like Keir Starmer endorsed this
mhm,
idea of
yeah,
completely, removing, cutting food and the rest of it from the Gaza Strip, to getting to this point. I mean, unless they felt like the American direction was, going in a way in which it's completely frustrated with Israel, they wouldn't have the courage or the strength to make these kinds of points. But
yeah, and again, I don't think this is necessarily why like Iran has to do anything right now. It's like this self destructive genocide happening in Gaza is what's going to like I think
need to its
over
end.
the next years going to end the whole thing because again mentioning that Israel is a country that doesn't have a lot of strategic depth in terms of like conventional terms, that means there's not a lot of standoff between your front lines where the conflict's happening and your industrial centers, which could be targeted. Of course, it doesn't have any strategic depth like that because when they first started fighting against Hezbollah, Intel canceled their plans to build like a $800 million Intel chip factory there because Israel's no longer secure. So that's one aspect of strategic depth, but it also applies to politics and economics. All of our aid packages to Israel aren't just weapons. They're stimulus packages which the Israeli government can plug into different economic sectors, and they have discretion over that as well, because they need to be propped up economically. When you have such a small population and you call up 100,000 reservists who are no longer in the workforce, who still have to pay rent and all their bills, so you have to pay them. Like the biggest military expenditure is not bombs; it's payroll, paying your
Yeah.
soldiers.
Yeah.
So
That's
this,
an economic drain, isn't it?
yeah, it's massive. So that's why
Exactly. In
our
exchange for what? What is America getting in exchange for that? Is the question right now.
well, right. Well, Donald Trump's an economic quid pro quo guy, and there's no pro quo. Yeah.
Exactly.
So
Exactly. And ultimately, it's war that is holding Israel together right now. It's like the moment the war ends, that is when a man like Netanyahu will be sidelined. Netanyahu's, you can argue, one of the strongest, powerful figures within the country who's able to single handedly carry the country through a war like
yeah,
this.
he's kind of like a political Houdini. Every time you think he's done, he wriggles out of it somehow.
Somehow comes back, right? Right. But what happens completely, the contradictions are going to surface post-war. And we already see those contradictions right now.
Yeah, I think the most glaring. I mean, we could go into like the economic conditions like that exist just within liberalism itself, but the world's greatest, like the only democracy in the Middle East. How so?
Right.
You're literally beating and arresting hostage families who are protesting.
Right.
It's not a good look, but also when the sanctions start happening, and it doesn't even have to come to the U.S. first, from the U.S. first, it can come from France, it can come
Right.
from Spain.
Right.
But once that starts getting normalized because they don't have any strategic depth, it's going to be like an avalanche, and the entire house of cards is going to go into cascade failure because if Western support stops, they're done.
I think you've hit the nail on the head when you say sanctions coming in as a result of the lack of strategic depth. And people forget that. Like, it's not a moral, oh, we've had enough of seeing the images of dead babies. If Israel managed to defeat Hamas, we would not be seeing any of this.
No.
We'd be seeing the complete opposite. It's their lack of ability to achieve anything on the ground that is leading to this kind of reaction from the West. It's Israel's failures. And this is what we need to focus on. Israel was created as this project to do a certain job. It's not like America's ideologically Zionist and believes in Israel's inherent right to exist. If there was no Israel, would invent an Israel. That's how the West feels towards this
Joe
entity.
Biden said it in the 80s or the 70s, I think. It's if there wasn't an Israel, we'd have to create one. Because Zionism is not the ideology of the United States. It's capitalism.
100%. I fully agree with that. It is it's the interests of capital that is what is driving the empire. Israel is seen as a part of that. Israel is seen as a driver.
Of course, their tech sector and their defense sector is integrated into ours. But then again, if they're going to become a net negative.
So that's the thing. It's like a collusion of interests over here, you know? It's like the Zionists are hunters for sources of power that could actualize their vision of a Jewish homeland. And then the imperialists are like, okay, this is where we'll place you because this is conducive to our interests. So it's that net merging of interests over here. And when we look at the Zionist lobby, that's just a reflection. Again, it's an echo for Israel on the ground. So if Israel is weak on the ground, you best believe that those lobbies inherently with time will also lose their strategic ability to influence, right? Despite the fact that they are obviously deeply rooted. You're talking about how many years? You're talking about 7.5 decades over here of it being inherently entrenched within the political system. But ultimately, it's been seen as a part of the American strategy itself. The defense for Israel is because Israel is seen as our project. And so the biggest harm for America would be Israel being defeated at the hands of the resistance. Because what happens if Israel is defeated at the hands of the resistance? The resistance gets stronger. And this resistance is against our interests in the region.
And this is why, from a strategic perspective, why this is so insane. And this is why Iran can afford to exercise strategic patience. It's basically a tenet of military science when it comes to asymmetrical warfare, which is basically where you have one side that has a bunch of stuff, tank divisions, air force, 100,000 man infantry reserves, and then another side with none of that, using guerrilla tactics and flip-flops, fighting against each other. So the basic premise of fourth generation asymmetrical warfare is if you're the imperial occupying power, you have all these fancy tools and stuff, and you are accountable to it like a free press and the people. You live in a democratic society. You have to win. You have to defeat the resistance forces. The United States had to defeat the Viet Cong in order to win. But all the Viet Cong had to do was just not lose.
Right.
And that's what victory looks like in asymmetrical warfare.
And what is the main ingredient for not losing? It's the morale and the conviction in the cause that you believe in. And that's proven to be the most essential component of any battle.
Yeah.
You know, is the people's belief and conviction. Because right now, if the Palestinians decide, okay, and I mean, would you blame someone under 20 months of complete bombardment and seeing what the people of Gaza have seen to say, okay, if you can relocate us to somewhere else where...
Of course not.
Right? But they remain standing, you know?
Right. And
they remain rejecting those plans. It's like, we're not going to hand over, we're not going to allow the second Nakba to happen. It's that principle. We'd rather die in our land than hand it over to you. And it's more honorable for us to be killed here than to be relocated and to have fulfilled your dream.
Yeah. And now the West has to decide whether they're going to just sit by and watch the final stage of a genocide and lose all soft power throughout the world and alienate the entire global South forever, and maybe to a point where the Arab states can no longer be as comprador to Western interests as they were before, or they're going to have to start doing something.
Right. That's exactly it. I mean, Trump's plan A was fatten the entity. You failed. Plan B, let's try and remove the people of Gaza so that way we enhance the Jewish majority within the country. If that fails, what are you left with?
It's going to fail. Where are they going to go? He can't bring him to the U.S. with his immigration policy. Jordan can't take him. That would destabilize. You can't put him in the Sinai where Egypt's already fighting a low-grade counterinsurgency against the Bedouin.
The people won't leave either. The people themselves, if you hear their statements, they will say, over my dead, like.
And they're especially not going to be like, yeah, you know what, Libya? I'm going to go to Libya.
Like
it's insane.
You've just like the Ghazni resistance has managed to recruit in the thousands in these past 20 months.
They created a whole new fun acronym: Wounded Child, No Surviving Family. So they're never going to run out of recruits.
It's like, what else are you able to do when your life is fighting this occupation? That's it. Like that is your life. That is seen as the most honorable thing. And until America comes to really truly recognize this reality, I think Trump needed to see it for himself. With the resumption of the war, him seeing Israel's extent of defeat, that's it.
And do you think, ultimately, circling back to the original subject of this, do you think this failure of Israel will enhance or at least render less adversarial U.S.-Iranian relations?
I think for sure, because Israel's a red line for Iran. It's a red line that it will never be able to overcome or overstep. And it's always going to remain that obstacle. Because, as I mentioned right from the onset, from 1979, if you listen to Imam Khomeini's speeches, he made it very clear that he called it a cancerous tumor that needs to be uprooted from this region. So we won't settle until this cancerous tumor is uprooted. And if Israel continues to exist with American support and continues to be defeated, America just continues to drain itself, but to also enhance the resistance movements on the ground. So it's almost like without Israel, you'll be having less emboldened and active resistance,
right?
Which is what Israel was created to reign in the first place. So almost Israel's existence becomes self-defeating when it is unable to consolidate itself strategically and to achieve any gains. And the resistance, anyways, 4 decades of sanctions hasn't crippled it, and it continues to grow stronger. So if you compare Iran's military prowess from 2018 to now, it's much stronger than it was back then. And its ability to enrich is also much stronger. Like Iran's reached the levels of 60% uranium enrichment. Like it's only developing more and more with time. And it's only getting stronger. And Iran is also making use of all the intelligence and the security penetrations that it's learnt about, especially during this period of 20 months. So that's something that we also have to emphasize. Even with the Islamic resistance in Lebanon, people might look at it and say, it's weaker than it was prior to the war, but it's like it needed to realize the weaknesses that exist in order to further build itself or to restructure itself foundationally. It's like the state that it was in before didn't match the true reality. The war came and exposed where all the defects are and where the holes are, that will now enable itself to form a stronger foundation from which it can rise, and it can use different means and methods of warfare within this new phase. But the battle continues, right? Because the ideology is strong. And the ideology is one of, we want to uproot Zionism. If you hear the speeches of Sayyid Ali Khamenei, he says the Israeli occupation entity will be eliminated. That is going to happen. Like he speaks about it as though it has happened, like he's seeing it. So that tells you the drive and the resolve and the determination that exists. And so if America wants to secure its true interests, it will recognize the real and active forces on the ground, ultimately.
Yeah, unfortunately, there are some people, even within Trump's cabinet, that are driven by ideology. And I would just like to, I guess, end on propaganda. So, right outside the Ministry of Defense here, Horse Guards here in London, there is a permanent encampment of what some people are confused by, and I get a lot of questions. What's up with these Iranian Zionists? They have this permanent encampment set up, just like a Palestine encampment, with a bunch of like propaganda. Iran, the octopus of terror, political assassinations, hijackings, everything like that. And you can also see Israeli flags within the same sphere of like anti-Iranian government Iranians doing that. So could you explain why we see what's kind of a confusing message for someone?
Dollar.
Yeah.
That's it. I mean, is there a bigger manifestation of selling your soul? I mean, the moment you see that, right? It's any movement co-opted by the Zionists. I mean, it's self-explanatory,
Yeah.
You're almost self-defeating. It's like if you want to stand up for Iran, you're not going to garner the sympathy of the world by receiving the support of the Israeli occupation entity.
Yeah, I guess people find it bizarre, and I guess bottom line, like the Iranians who support Israel, because there are a lot of them, they're generally in the diaspora, and they want to see a shah who was a bourgeois dictator in his time, but now his grandson reinstalled.
They're tools of American imperialism, and they're not. So if they have a cause, and that's to topple the Islamic Republic, they're not really helping their cause, right?
Mm-hmm.
They're not helping their cause globally, especially at such a time. But ultimately, they are revealing their true colors, and that is that they are literally playthings at the hands of the imperialists, and they use them to secure their goals.
Yeah, it's almost like Western imperialism rooted in white supremacy needs the collaboration of people of color from the region itself.
But they're so insignificant also.
Yeah, but we prop them up with like think tanks and conferences that are like senators like John McCain used to go to all the time.
Right. But the reality on the ground is the Iranian population, 80 million, is standing strong.
Yeah, I mean, one of our biggest tools in terms of U.S. hard power is our economic sanctions. And basically how those work for y'all, if you're new to the concept, is we put a bunch of economic sanctions on your country. We try to starve out the middle class. So there's only there's only like the ruling class and everybody else who's poor. And then we'll do that in conjunction with a massive intelligence propaganda campaign and try to spark a popular class-based revolution, which is something we don't want in our own country because we're capitalists. We don't want class consciousness happening, but we're totally fine with it happening in other countries as long as we have like a right-wing candidate like the Shah to go and replace him. So that hasn't happened yet. We've been trying to get it done since the 80s.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's a reflection of the Iranian internal street. But also, I'd add, in terms of the democratic process in Iran, because not many people know, actually, I'd argue the extent of the democracy. So when you have the elections that happen every 4-year periods, you have about 6-7 candidates that the people of Iran can choose from. And Iran has conventionally alternated between the reformist camp and the conservative camp.
And Pezeshkian, the current president, is a reformist.
He's reformist, exactly. And whoever is in power actually has a tangible effect on the reality of the events and how they transpire. So maybe if someone like Raisi was still in power, you probably would have seen Operation True Promise 3 commence. And that probably would have led to different results on the ground, militarily speaking. I mean, having someone like Raisi was the equivalent of the IRGC in government. So you can imagine he was aligned with the vision of the supreme leader, Sayyid Ali Khamenei. But it's also worth noting that, Sayyid Ali Khamenei, he is the supreme leader of the country. He sets the general boundaries and the ballparks, but he doesn't impose them either. So he is someone who was against the JCPOA. He didn't support negotiations.
And that is the nuclear deal spearheaded by the Obama administration.
Yeah, he didn't support it. But if we take a look at how he speaks with the Iranian nation, he says negotiations are not wise. It's not a good idea. Why? America cannot be trusted. I
mean, he's saying the same thing. I think it just came out in Reuters. Yeah.
That's the way that he talks with the Iranian nation. But did he stop the Rouhani government from signing the JCPOA? No. And was what he said materialized? And did he prove his point? Yes. So in a way, his approach with the Iranian nation is to show the people of Iran through the material realities, this is the truth, and it's almost like the Iranians they alternate. It's like once they have a reformist, they want a conservative. Once they have a conservative, they want a reformist. So I would say in Iran, it's actually the democratic process is very active and it's very energized. And there's a lot of internal debates and criticisms that happen that the West is completely
ignorant of it. Yeah.
Completely ignorant.
Yeah. I think we're taught to have this impression that it's a theocratic council of clerics that does everything and determines everything.
And can I add also that clerical establishment that you're talking about? So whoever elects the supreme leader, you have about 108 who sit on the Assembly of Experts. Those are all elected by the people of Iran. So it's actually the supreme leader is elected by 108 experts who each one of them is elected within the 13 provinces in the Islamic Republic. People don't know that, They look at the supreme leader, oh, he's been sitting there for 30 years. What mandate does he have? Well, there's an indirect mandate through the people as per the democratic process that the people of Iran signed up to in 1979 when there was a popular referendum and 98.9% of them said no East, no West Islamic Republic. And this is the West that testifies to the fact that 98.9% of the Iranians at that time supported the revolution. It's a well-known fact, you know. It's a very unsettling, uncomfortable reality for the West that 20 million people will come out in Qasem Soleimani's funeral, for example.
Yep.
You'd like to label him as a terrorist, but to Iranians, when they actually polled, they had a few figures and they polled who was the most popular. Soleimani got, you know, one of the highest votes for the most popular candidate or figure in general within Iran. So it reveals a lot in terms of the ignorance that exists in the West.
Yeah. Well, I think people are starting to learn more about it just because the material conditions here in America are just degrading. I'm just like, why are we doing this, man? Why are we doing another global war, trying to do another global war on terror 2.0? Like, why? Even Marjorie Taylor Greene, I don't know if you're familiar with that U.S. politician at all. No. Anyways, the American audience will know exactly who she is. Very far-right ideologue. He even came out as generally a war hawk, came out and said, why are we fighting the Houthis? I don't even know who the Houthis are. You know? And I was like, okay, you know what? It's kind of disturbing that you're an elected official who sits on like foreign relations committees. But you know what? At this point, I'll take it. Don't fight the Houthis because I don't know who they are. Cool. That's a step in the right direction. So hopefully we'll keep going down that way, and hopefully people will start educating themselves about Iran. The narrative shifting, I don't think Israel can regain the information war initiative. I think that's pretty much done. And hopefully...
which is the most important part in any movement.
Yeah.
That information war. Yeah. We've been describing how coups and color revolutions are a product of that.
Yeah. And, you know...
It's material, you know?
Also, Israel's propaganda machine and image was a multi-generational effort to build. It was like a medieval cathedral. It took generations to get it done.
And it took 20 months to completely... That's the power of the blood that's given on the ground. You know, that blood is not in vain when you look at the way that it's tectonically shifting the world. Yeah.
So we're at an inflection point. Things are going to change. Not sure exactly how it's going to pan out, but we will be here, continue to report and commentate. Is that's a word? Comment upon on it. So thank you. I think we're going to wrap here, y'all. Hope you enjoyed kind of the freeform discussion about Iran, Israel, the United States, and all these actors. Thanks so much to Batool Subeiti for coming on and talking to us about this.
Thank you so much for having me. It's an absolute pleasure.
All right. Cheers, y'all. If you're picking up what we're putting down, I am supposed to plug our Patreon. We are demonetized on most platforms, being a small independent newsroom that doesn't take any corporate sponsorships. So if you could help us out, that'd be great. Also, if you're getting nickeled and dimed in the death throes of late-stage capitalism and can't swing it, like, share, and subscribe. We're just glad you're here. And we'll see you next time. Cheers, y'all.